Snow fell in delicate flakes on the Whitmore mansion that winter night. Inside the main hall, the sound of violins filled the air, but it wasn't the music that made Evelyn's heart race. It was his gaze. Sitting before the black grand piano, his fingers gliding over the keys as if touching the very soul of the universe, was Samuel. A simple pianist hired to entertain the elite, but to her he seemed more noble than all the lords, earls, and magnates gathered in that hall. Evelyn knew she was dangerous. It was forbidden, but it was inevitable. As the final notes of the song echoed through the hall, Samuel lowered his gaze, as if knowing he had gone too far. Evelyn took a deep breath, trying to hide the storm raging in her chest. But try as she might, there was no denying it. Something was about to happen, something that would change her life forever. If you also believe that the heart always finds its way, let your like that's it subscribe to the channel, because this story will keep you hooked until the last chapter. The engagement announcement came like a crystal snap. Glasses raised, flashes, applause. Evelyn smiled for the cameras. Count Richard at her side held her waist with the precise pressure of someone who learns early on to possess what they desire. "To our union," he said, and the guests echoed like a well-rehearsed chorus. Samuel, at the piano, tried to gather the sheet music, but the master of ceremonies asked for just one more, to celebrate the newlyweds. He played. It wasn't a European waltz or an elegant standard. It was a new melody, sweet and syncopated, as if a snowflake melted in a glass of bourbon. The music opened invisible spaces in the room, and within them lay what Evelyn couldn't say. A sustained note trembled. Then, amid violin bows and suppressed laughter, her diamond bracelet slipped from her wrist and fell into the piano's body with a secret clink. "Allow me," Samuel murmured, carefully opening the side flap. His fingers disappeared into the shadows of the strings. When he returned, the jewel rested in his palm, and a rectangle of white paper, thin as a whisper, was folded between his thumb and the ring. Evelyn took the bracelet with her right hand. With the other, quick as a wing-beat, she gathered the note. Richard leaned in to kiss her temple. "Tomorrow morning, the press at the plaza. They'll like the photos," he said, his smile polished like silver. Evelyn's father, across the room, watched her with eyes like financial statements. She opened the note under the protection of her silk fan. 2 words, a time, an address. Conservatory Roof, 22 Tour. The music ended. The applause came late. Samuel closed the piano lid, but before he walked away, he caught Evelyn's eye again. There was no boldness, there was urgency. "What a piece, folks," Richard commented, setting his glass down on a table. "Do you know the musician?" "Event contractor," Evelyn's father replied, approaching. "By the way, we'll have changes. The Whitmore's company and the Harringtons are co-signing for the quarter. Absolute discretion." Then, more quietly, "And keep your distance from the pianist. He gets carried away." At 10 o'clock sharp, the Manhattan wind swept the snow from the conservatory roof. Evelyn, wrapped in a white lab coat, pushed open the metal door. The city pulsed below like a giant piano. She took a step. The yellow light outlined her shadow, and then a voice behind her. "You didn't come because of the bracelet." Evelyn spun around. Samuel stood there, breathing cold as smoke. Before she could respond, the roof door slammed shut again. Boots. 2 silhouettes. One said, "Miss Whitmore, your father asked us to fetch you." The other held something that gleamed darkly in the darkness. Not a weapon, but the key to the social cage. "Choose, Evelyn," Samuel whispered. "If you stay, the music starts. If you get down, the music ends." The wind took the last word, and the city below held its breath. Manhattan, winter. The avenues lit up like trails of stars. Upper East Side shop windows displaying dresses that seemed made of polished ice. Evelyn Whitmore was 24, with a degree in art history, an elegance inherited from 3 generations of philanthropists, and a name that opened heavy doors, especially when the door led to a gala. She grew up amid auctions at the Met, afternoons at the Frick, concerts at Carnegie Hall. Her teenage notebooks contained sketches of facades and Notes on light, the delicate strokes of someone who saw the world not as a showcase but as a composition. The Whitmore family controlled a logistics conglomerate that had begun with ships, expanded into railroads, and recently attempted to reinvent itself with distribution centers and technology. Her father, Arthur, believed in the phrase, "the name is the asset," and had decided to protect it like covering a flame with a glass, smothering the oxygen of his daughter's choices so that the glow would never waver. Her mother, Helena, preferred the grammar of invitations, perfect syntax without erasures, where each person had their correct place in the sentence. It was in this language of appearances that Richard Harrington III fit as the main subject. A British man by true title, educated at Eton, and heir to a fortune in energy and investments, he had brought to the American market an old-fashioned charm, with the efficiency of an algorithm. His presence in the society columns was constant, his voice controlled, his gestures polite even when they were in order. For Arthur, the union between Whitmore and Harrington was more than an alliance. It was the seal that would breathe life into the projects that were faltering in the next quarter's financial statements. Evelyn understood this mathematics. However, she also understood something that couldn't be written down on a spreadsheet, certain notes that don't follow the time signature. Ever since she was little, when her governess took her to Sunday concerts, Evelyn would hide behind the seats to watch the pianist. There was a gap between the raising of her hands and the touching of the keys in which the world was suspended. She wanted to live in that gap. She grew up believing that one day off the stage, she would find a life as honest as music. Samuel didn't know he was that someone. The son of a Queen's waitress who kept a small diner open late and a trumpeter who left too soon, he had learned to play on a wall piano with 2 broken keys and a lot of stubbornness. He had been through auditions, through doors half open and others that closed silently. He studied at the Manhattan Conservatory thanks to an anonymous donation. Rumor in the hallway said it was from an English patron who liked to bet on the improbable. Samuel didn't have a surname that opened doors. He opened them with his hands, literally, and with quiet discipline. At night he played in hotels. In the mornings he taught beginners in the neighborhood. In the afternoons he rehearsed on the conservatory roof because there the wind sharpened his doubts. Their meeting wasn't impossible. New York loves intersections, but it was unlikely. Their first contact wasn't that snowy night. Weeks earlier, Evelyn had escaped a museum committee meeting and, following a sound trickling down the stairs, found herself in front of a rehearsal room. Samuel was repeating a difficult passage, purposefully missing the same note, as if poking at the right wound to learn how to heal it. She stood behind the door, breathing slowly so as not to leak her presence. When the music stopped, he noticed the reflection of her silhouette in the glass and said, without turning, "Sometimes the answer is in the silence between the notes." Evelyn excused herself, came in, and they talked for just 3 minutes about Chopin, rain, and the weight of names. Then each returned to their own world. Until the night of the announcement. Until the note on the roof. Until the choice. The conflict there wasn't just a triangle between an heiress, a count, and a pianist. It was the city and its invisible scaffolding. It was the idea that some lives follow polished paths and others walk on steel cables. It was, above all, the question Samuel's music had planted in Evelyn's heart. Who writes the score of her life? Time. Today. A phone that vibrates in your pocket but falls silent before an honest chord. Networks that narrate perfections while flawed. Products replicate the same showcase. However, love, when it is love, still enters like an improvisation that dismantles the repertoire. Promise to a count, but her heart chose the pianist, is a story about the courage to break with what is expected of us, and in doing so find a new tone. It's about saying no to a contract that saves a company but condemns a soul, and saying yes to a melody that doesn't pay the bills but gives meaning to the day. The social scene is painfully elegant. There are receptions with arrangements of winter lilies, charity auctions in gilded halls, dinners where the conversation always seems to revolve around what can't be said. But there's also the basement of jazz clubs in the village, a coffee-scented kitchen in Queens, a conservatory rooftop that becomes an independent country when the first notes begin. The engine of the story begins with a simple and impossible question. What is worth more, the promise they made for you, or the promise you make to yourself? Evelyn will have to navigate halls, corridors, and fire escapes. Samuel will have to overcome his own fear of not being enough for someone who lives in the spotlight. Richard, not a textbook villain, but a man accustomed to winning, will have to decide whether he loves Evelyn or the idea of possessing her. Everyone, without exception, will discover that New York has a habit of dropping masks, even the most expensive ones. When the wind closes the roof door and the footsteps approach, the story finally begins. Evelyn's breath formed small clouds in front of her face. The wind blew harder on the conservatory's roof, spreading her coat like white wings against the darkness. Samuel stood a few steps away, his eyes fixed on her, as if every second were a chord that could not be wasted. "You shouldn't be here," Evelyn said, clutching the note between her fingers, her heart pounding. Samuel took a deep breath. "Maybe not, but I shouldn't have written what I wrote either." His sincerity disarmed her. Evelyn was accustomed to rehearsed phrases, calculated looks, promises that came with invisible clauses. But there, on that rooftop, there was no contract, only cold, wind, and a melody that still vibrated in the air. Behind them, the figures that appeared hesitated. They were family security guards sent by her father. Evelyn noticed. Samuel did too. "Miss Whitmore," one of the men said neutrally, "your father asks you to come down. Mr. Harrington is waiting to escort you to the hotel." She closed her eyes for a moment. The weight of the decision was crushing, but then she heard in the distance the sound of a siren on the avenue, a dissonant, urban sound, almost like a broken chord. And she remembered Samuel's words from weeks before. Sometimes the answer is in the silence between the notes. She opened her eyes. The silence between the notes was there, in that suspended moment, in which she could still choose. "Tell my father I'll be home soon." "I need a few minutes," she replied firmly, surprising even herself. The men looked at each other. The older man nodded, perhaps recognizing in her firmness a spark of inherited authority. They retired, closing the door behind them. The air felt lighter. Samuel took a step forward. "You risked a lot just to be here." "I'll risk it even more if you're not," she replied in a whisper. He held out his hand, hesitant, as if offering a fragile bridge. Evelyn, with an almost imperceptible gesture, placed her fingers over his. It was simple, but it carried an intensity no diamond could match. Below, the lights of Manhattan spread out like constellations. Evelyn felt small before the vastness, but at the same time free, as if for the first time she'd found room to breathe. "Samuel," he began, but stopped. He didn't know what to say. He saved her from the silence. "I don't know why you came, but I know that if you leave now, you'll carry this weight forever." The sentence pierced the layers of convention surrounding her. Evelyn sensed that this night wouldn't end with a simple goodbye, but she also knew that from then on, every choice would come at a price. The cold grew stronger. The clock in the nearby tower struck 11 times, and with each chime, the certainty grew. This was only the first step. The next morning, Evelyn awoke to light filtering through the blue silk curtains of her bedroom. The city still seemed asleep, but inside, a whirlwind reigned. The newspapers on her dressing table announced her official engagement to Earl Richard Harrington III. There were black and white photographs, her perfect smile, his confident gaze, an impeccable portrait of high society. Not a single line mentioned the pianist, not a single line ever should. But Evelyn couldn't forget the conservatory roof, the cold on her face, and the intensity of Samuel's gaze. As she combed her hair, she felt torn between two versions of herself, the exemplary Whitmore daughter, promised a secure future, and the woman who found in every chord an invitation to freedom. In the breakfast room, his mother Helena was waiting with a steaming cup of tea. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, without looking up from the newspaper. "Sleep," said Evelyn. Her father came in shortly after, adjusting his shirt cuffs. "Evelyn, today you'll have a photo shoot at the plaza with Richard. We need to project an image of solidity, of continuity. Don't forget that everything we do now is being watched." She nodded, silently, swallowing the urge to say that her life was not a propaganda painting. At the conservatory across town, Samuel was preparing for the day of rehearsals. He had little time to dream. Commitments were many, and bills couldn't wait. But something in him had changed since the night before. He was playing differently. It wasn't just technique or discipline anymore. It was as if Evelyn had ignited a spark of urgency in him, a need to prove that there was beauty beyond convention. That same day, fate decided to play a trick on them. The plaza photo shoot was taking place in the grand ballroom, whose glass doors overlooked the main lobby. And it was there, mid-afternoon, that Evelyn caught a glimpse of Samuel. He was crossing the room with a folder of sheet music under his arm, his expression focused, as if he had a recital in a few hours. Her heart raced. The photographer asked her to smile, to tilt her head toward Richard, but her eyes had already found another escape route. Samuel noticed. He didn't greet her, he knew he couldn't, but the brief look in his eyes was enough to shatter the illusion of perfection. Later, during recess, Evelyn slipped discreetly into the side hallway. She found Samuel alone, reviewing sheet music near the service door. "I didn't know you played here," she said, her voice low, almost a secret. "I'm just part of the scenery," he replied with a small smile. "While you live in the picture, I'll take care of the background music." The irony was gentle, but it stung. Evelyn leaned closer. "The music is never in the background, Samuel, not for me." He looked at her intensely but held back his emotion. "Then you understand the risk. Every time you cross my path, your life could fall apart." "Maybe I want to take a chance," he confessed, almost without realizing his own words. There was a heavy silence. The world seemed suspended again, as it had been before a note. Samuel took a deep breath, closed his sheet music folder, and simply said, "Then come to the conservatory recital tomorrow. No one needs to know." Richard's footsteps echoed down the hallway, calling her name. Evelyn stepped back, straightened her dress, and quickly replied, "I'll be there." She returned to the hall before the groom noticed anything wrong, but the flame inside her was already lit. That night, lying in bed, Evelyn clutched the hidden invitation to the recital. With each heartbeat, the feeling that her life was about to change grew stronger. She didn't know if she would find freedom or ruin, but she knew she would find Samuel. The night of the recital arrived shrouded in anticipation Evelyn couldn't hide. The conservatory was lit up like a sparkling jewel in the heart of Manhattan. Black cars stopped before the staircase. Ladies in fur stoles and gentlemen in long coats ascended the steps with the elegant haste of those who knew they were about to witness something rare. Evelyn, draped in a deep blue gown, felt her heart race with every step. She'd told her mother she was going to a museum committee meeting, but it was a lie. For the first time in a long time, Evelyn had chosen her own destination. She sat discreetly in the third row, blending into the audience. No one seemed to notice her. After all, everyone was looking at the stage. Samuel entered. The room fell silent. He wore nothing but a simple suit, but there was a quiet assurance in his walk. He sat at the piano, adjusted the score, and took a deep breath. The first note echoed like a revelation. It was Chopin, but not the classic, predictable Chopin of gala auditions. Samuel played with raw intensity, coaxing from the piano not just melody, but truth. Each chord seemed to expose his soul, and Evelyn felt as if each keystroke were a confession addressed to her. The audience was enchanted, but Evelyn knew the music held something more, a message hidden between the notes. When Samuel closed his eyes, when he stretched out a silence, it was as if he were speaking directly to her. "I see you, I choose you." Her eyes filled with discreet tears. Never had anyone spoken so clearly without using a single word. At the end of the first play, the applause was thunderous. But Samuel didn't look at the audience at large. For a moment, his eyes met only hers, and the world disappeared. Between breaks, Evelyn paced the lobby, trying to compose herself. Then she heard a voice that chilled her. "Evelyn." He turned. Richard Harrington was standing a few feet away, impeccably dressed in a tuxedo. a smile of surprise and curiosity on his face. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, offering his arm. "I came to support some patrons of the conservatory, but you hadn't said anything." Evelyn thought quickly. "A friend invited me at the last minute. I didn't want to refuse." Richard studied her silently, then smiled politely. "I'm glad. Perhaps we can support the institution even more when we're married." She forced a smile, but her heart was beating like a war drum. The second act began. Evelyn returned to her seat, but this time Richard sat beside her. Samuel, upon re-emerging, noticed immediately. His fingers hovered over the keys for a second longer than usual. Then he began to play. The music was different, darker, more intense. It was like a silent duel. Every note seemed to challenge the golden walls of the hall, as if Samuel were shouting, "She is not yours." Evelyn noticed, and so did Richard. The Earl narrowed his eyes, but maintained his composure. At the height of the piece, Evelyn felt something almost unbearable. The weight of choice became increasingly real. The recital wasn't just music, it was a battlefield. When the last note echoed, the audience rose to its feet in applause. Richard clapped coldly and measuredly. Evelyn inwardly trembled. Samuel stood, bowed, and before leaving the stage, he gave one final look. There was no pleading, only conviction. It was as if to say, "Now it's your decision." Outside, in the cold of the night, Evelyn found herself alone again for a few moments, her heart still pounding with the intensity of the music. Suddenly, Samuel appeared, coming through a side exit. He approached with quick steps, his breath visible in the frigid air. "You came," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Evelyn just nodded, unable to contain her smile. "I had to come." He held her hand, and for a moment, everything stopped. The noise of the cars, the cold, the pressure of society. Nothing mattered, just the two of them, finally in sync. But before he could say anything else, Richard's deep voice cut through the air. "Evelyn." She turned. The Count stood a few feet away, watching them with cold eyes. The silence that followed was heavier than any music. Evelyn realized there would be no hiding anymore. The air froze between them. Evelyn, her hand still clasped in Samuel's, felt like a rope stretched too thin, about to snap. Richard's gaze, fixed, was piercing. There was no overt anger, just a calculated coldness, like a chess player discovering a misplaced piece on the board. "Evelyn," the Count repeated, his tone wavering between forced affection and veiled command. "It's not too late for us to return to the plaza." Samuel remained motionless. He didn't let go of her hand, but he didn't move forward either. His silence was as eloquent as the music that had played hours before. Evelyn took a deep breath. "Richard, I was just congratulating the pianist." "Congratulating?" The Count's smile didn't reach his eyes. "It seemed like something more intimate to me." She tried to answer, but Samuel intervened, his voice low and firm. "The music may sound intimate, sir, but it's just music." Richard approached, each step echoing in the cold courtyard like a marked beat. "Just music," he says, curious, "because it seems to me that to some it sounds like promise." Samuel held the Count's gaze without wavering. Evelyn felt her heartbeat between the two, men as if it were the battlefield itself. "Richard, please," she said, trying to ease the tension. "Let's talk about this another time." The Count took a deep breath, adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo, and smiled again with that dangerous calm. "Of course, I don't want a public scene." Then he looked at Samuel one last time. "But be careful, pianist. Certain melodies, when played in the wrong room, can cost you dearly." He turned his back, offered Evelyn his arm, and waited. She hesitated. The gesture was an ultimatum disguised as chivalry. For a second, Evelyn considered refusing, but the image of her parents, the press, and the promise she'd made to society weighed heavily on her shoulders. She slowly released Samuel's hand and leaned on the Count's arm. Samuel's eyes didn't accuse her, but they still hurt. There was only bitter understanding in them, like someone who understands too much. The ride to the car was silent. Richard settled her in the back seat, gave instructions to the driver, and only then said, "Evelyn, you know what's at stake. This wedding isn't just about us, it's about families, fortunes, reputations." She turned her face to the window, where the lights of Manhattan flashed past like sparks. "I know what's at stake, but I also know what I feel." Richard was silent for several long seconds. Then, in a low, almost confidential voice, he said, "I won't stop you from dreaming, but dream carefully." The rest of the journey was silent. That night, alone in her room, Evelyn removed her engagement ring and placed it on the bedside table. The diamond reflected the light like a cold mirror. She closed her eyes and remembered the warmth of Samuel's hand, his gaze, the song that seemed to have been written just for her. Meanwhile, at the conservatory, Samuel remained alone in the empty hall, playing to himself. Each note was an unanswered question, each pause a silence that weighed more heavily than applause. They both knew that night had changed everything. There was no going back. The confrontation wasn't just between two men or two families. It was between the life Evelyn was supposed to live and the life she wanted to live. And deep down, both Samuel and Richard understood the same truth. Her heart had already chosen. The next morning, the Whitmore house smelled of cut flowers and expensive coffee. Evelyn walked down the hallway of family paintings as if walking through a museum that didn't belong to her. The ring still rested on the bedside table. It seemed less a symbol and more a stamp. Downstairs, Arthur discussed numbers on the phone, his voice sharp. Helena reviewed the guest list for a charity dinner, her pen crossing out with discipline. When she saw her daughter, she smiled briefly. The smile one offers to the press, not to intimate friends. At 4, meeting with the designer. At 6, dinner at the Metropolitan Club. "And please don't disappear again," said the mother, without looking up completely. Evelyn nodded, but her hands were in her coat pocket, clutching a small envelope bearing the conservatory logo. He hadn't said he planned to leave before lunch. He hadn't said he wouldn't go to the club. He'd simply taken the elevator, crossed the lobby, and hailed a car. When the doors closed, she felt like a teenager again, the one who snuck out to listen to rehearsals through the crack in the door. The conservatory smelled of old wood and bow resin. She climbed the stairs without thinking, guided by a timid sound coming from a side room. Through the window in the door, she saw Samuel at the piano, surrounded by 3 students. A little girl with braids struggled with her left hand. A teenager bit his lip, uncertain. An old man in a cap grimaced as he made a mistake. Samuel smiled patiently, demonstrating, asking for silence, asking for courage. Evelyn pressed her forehead against the glass, invisible, and was overcome by a feeling as simple as it was rare, belonging. When class ended, Samuel opened the door and found her there, half courage, half guilt. There were no questions. "Come on," he said simply, grabbing his coat. "I want to show you something." They walked down the avenue to the subway. She wanted to pay for a taxi. He said there was no need to rush. The train ripped through the darkness like a bass note. Across the river, Queens greeted her with peeling facades, tired neon signs, and, paradoxically, a warmth Manhattan seemed to have forgotten. Samuel's mother's coffee shop, Rosie's After Hours, had vinyl stools, a chalkboard with a handwritten menu, and photographs of musicians taped to the wall. Rosie, in her red apron, didn't find Evelyn strange. What she found strange was the impeccable delicacy of her coat amid the smell of bacon and coffee. She hugged her son with the strength of someone who's endured many a late night and gave the visitor a broad smile. "You're the girl who likes Chopin," he said, as if commenting on the weather. "Sit down, here we speak, softly when necessary and loudly when unavoidable." They sat at a table near the window. Rosie brought 2 mugs and a plate of apple pie so simple and so honest that Evelyn felt like crying for no reason. Samuel said little, he listened more. Evelyn recounted things that wouldn't fit in the society pages. The first time she felt small in an expensive dress. The afternoon she considered writing a catalogue of women forgotten by art history. The fear that her name would be a showcase that would swallow her whole. Samuel listened like someone reading a score for the first time, respecting the silences. "And you?" she asked after a while. "What are you afraid of?" He turned the mug in his hands thoughtfully. I fear that around you, I'll start playing again to prove something, not because I need to say something. Proof is tiring. Truth is calming. Outside, a young man leaning against a lamppost discreetly photographed the window. Evelyn didn't see it. Samuel did, and a shadow passed. Over his gaze, the secluded, sheltered world of the diner wasn't immune to the city's antennas. "Come," he said suddenly. "I want to show you the place where I compose when I forget that everything else exists." They walked 2 blocks to a charmless building. They climbed a narrow fire escape. On the roof there was nothing but antennas, water tanks, and an upright piano leaning against a tool shed covered by a blue tarp. Samuel removed the cover, exposing the scratched wood, tuned stubbornly. He played a chord. The sound was imperfect but lively. The wind ruffled Evelyn's hair. The city beyond seemed to shrink. "This is where I go wrong," he said, "where everything can be temporary until it becomes right." She rested her fingers on the keys hesitantly. She played 2 notes, then 3 more. She laughed, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. My governess tried to teach me when I was 8. I preferred drawing frames." "Frames are music too," Samuel replied. "They're pauses. They're choices about what's inside." His eyes met hers with gentle gratitude. The kiss came as an inevitable conclusion, unhurried, without an audience, without a plot. Just 2 faces drawn closer because the distance seemed absurd. It wasn't a gesture of conquest, it was one of recognition. Evelyn's phone vibrated. 8 missed calls, 2 messages from her mother, 1 from Richard's publicist. "Photographers asking for you. I need you at the club at 6. Are you with him?" The last, from the Count, had arrived, a minute ago. "Don't make me look foolish." The city regained its breath. Evelyn pulled back a little, consciousness returning in waves. "I don't want to hide you," she said, suddenly frightened by her own courage. "But I also don't want to turn this into a headline war." "I don't know how to fight headlines," Samuel admitted. "I only know how to play, and protect what's ours with silence if necessary." She nodded. There was tenderness in the pact, and yet the threat of the world. They returned to the diner to say goodbye to Rosie. As they left, 2 sharp clicks cut through the air. This time, Evelyn heard them. 2 young men pretended to check their cell phones. Samuel pulled her toward the side street. "See how it is?" he asked without accusation. "Any step becomes news." "Then let's choose the news," she replied with newfound courage. "Not today, but soon, in our own way." On the way back, Evelyn didn't get off at her usual stop. She asked the car to drop her off at her father's office. She went upstairs alone. Arthur was standing in front of a wall of screens with graphs. He was surprised to see her. "We need to talk," she said, before he could put on his CEO outfit. "About the engagement. About me." Arthur made as if to close the door. He didn't. "If it's about rumors, we have advisors. If it's about doubts, we have time. If it's about whims, we have consequences." Evelyn didn't tremble. "I'm not going to dinner tonight, and I want to postpone the wedding date. Indefinitely." The man, accustomed to quarterly forecasts, stared at his daughter as if watching a line on a graph veer off its axis. "Why?" She searched for the simplest words. "Because I just remembered that my life is mine, and because if I get married now, I'll be getting married in fear." The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was honest. Arthur leaned back, tired. For a moment, he wasn't the tycoon. He was a father who knew less than he cared to admit. "What if I told you we need this wedding?" he asked, not harshly. "Then I'll say you need a contract. I need a song." He studied her, trying to recognize in the woman before him the girl he took to watch boats at the pier. "What if the song doesn't pay the bills?" He tried a final argument. "Then I work." He smiled, with a lightness that dismantled armor. "You taught me that." Arthur ran his hand over his face, overcome by a fatigue that wasn't financial. "Go, but don't ask me to applaud." Evelyn understood. That day, victory would simply lie in not backing down. She left the office with her heart open, vulnerable and whole. In the hallway, her cell phone vibrated again. A new message from Richard, unceremoniously, without flourish. Dinner cancelled. We need to talk. Tomorrow. Below, a link to a gossip column. Harrington's fiancée disappears on inappropriate afternoon in Queens. The photo, taken from a distance, showed only Evelyn's silhouette in the diner window. Enough. On the terrace of the unassuming building, Samuel covered the piano with the tarp again. The wind predicted snow. He knew that after that kiss, neutrality was impossible. He walked to the stairs and, before descending, looked out at the city as if simultaneously grateful and challenging. He picked up his scorebook, dated the page, and wrote the title of a play that hadn't yet been written between the notes. That night, each slept on a different field of the same chessboard. Evelyn dreamed of a white room where she drew empty frames that little by little filled with music. Samuel dreamed of a spotlight-free stage where two chairs touched at the backs. And, in another neighborhood, Richard didn't dream. He worked. He made 2 discreet calls, contacted a trusted investigator, opened digital files. There was no anger in his actions. There was method. When he closed his laptop, the reflection of his own face on the glass returned a question he never needed to answer. When does love become a form of possession? The snow began to fall again silently. The city held its breath. And in the interval between one flake and the next, Evelyn's disobedience gathered pace. Early in the morning, Evelyn crossed Park Avenue in a grey coat that seemed to apologize for its existence. Richard had texted at 7, "Library 8 sharp, just the two of us." The chosen room in his townhouse had leather-panelled walls, tall windows, and a courtroom silence. On the table sat a manila envelope and 2 cups of coffee. Richard didn't come with flowers. He came with control. "Thank you for coming," he said, without kisses, without ceremony. "I prefer conversation to noise." He opened the envelope. The photographs of the Queen's diner slipped out like cards from a deck she didn't want to play. There was Evelyn's silhouette behind the window, Samuel in profile, one hand outstretched, his mother laughing behind the counter. There was nothing indecent, but there was intimacy. And yesterday's gossip column had been enough to turn any gesture into evidence. "I can handle the press," Richard said, with the calm of someone smoothing their own shadow. "But I can't handle you if you abandon me on stage. What happened at the conservatory wasn't discreet." Evelyn chose to breathe. "I don't want to humiliate you, but I can't keep pretending either." He nodded, unsurprised. "I know, and that's exactly why I won't blackmail you." He pulled out a second, thinner envelope. "Instead, I'll tell you a story." Inside was a single letter, a copy of an old thank-you note from the conservatory to an anonymous patron who had funded a full scholarship. The text was dry. The name was redacted. Richard touched the edge of the paper as if touching a scar. "When I moved to New York, I understood that patronage is politics," he said. "You invest in bridges. Someone told me about a kid from Queens with a bad piano and good persistence. I financed the scholarship. I didn't know his name, but later I learned. Samuel." Evelyn felt the ground shift an inch. A new speed surged in her chest. "You," he began, stopping mid-sentence. "Don't worry. I've never asked for anything in return, nor will I." He held her gaze almost gently. "But I need you to understand the map. I'm not a villain. And at the same time, I'm not a saint. I'd like to marry you. I also know how to recognize when someone looks at someone the way you looked at him." She rested her fingers on the edge of the table, reaching for the edge of the world. "Then why do you call me here?" "To offer an honest exit." Richard leaned back, and for the first time he seemed tired of himself. "If you choose the pianist, I will withdraw my partnership with your family. Not for revenge, for transparency. My advice will not be heeded if it seems motivated by humiliation, but I guarantee it won't come out of my mouth. I will say we've changed strategy, and I won't mention his name to the press. I have an aversion to lynchings." The words, carefully polished, were still stones. Evelyn imagined the Whitmore warehouses, workers in reflective vests, deadlines, trucks, families who depended on that riverbank. She also imagined the terrace with the crooked piano and Samuel's hands searching for a note that would spell his name. "How much time do I have?" Thalmity asked. "Sunday. The day after tomorrow. There's the Harrington Foundation Gala." The smile was a barely visible line. "If you're by my side, we'll know what was chosen. If you're not, I'll know anyway." In Queens, the mailman knocked on the counter of Rosie's After Hours and left an elegantly letter-headed envelope. Samuel opened it between orders for waffles and coffee, an invitation to perform at the Foundation Gala that Sunday, with a mention of renewal of support for artistic merit. The mug trembled in his hands. Rosie read it over her shoulder, raising an eyebrow. "Artistic merit with a political main course," he said, wiping the counter. "Son, kindness is beautiful. Dependence not always." It was him, Samuel concluded quietly, connecting dots he hadn't meant to connect. The anonymous patron. There was no bitterness on Rosie's face, there was experience. Rich people can do two things at once, good and gambling. The question is, what do you do? Samuel folded the invitation like someone folding a destiny. The word Sunday shone like a blade. Evelyn spent the afternoon in a museum, wandering through rooms of portraits that had survived worse scandals. She stopped before a small painting, a woman in a blue scarf staring back at the painter. Beside her, Maya, Evelyn's curator and friend, approached silently. They had a pact to tell the truth only when the light was right. "You're in love with someone other than your fiancé," Maya said simply. "I'm in love with someone who doesn't know what to do with it," Evelyn replied, with a sad half-smile. "Nobody knows. The difference is that some pretend." Maya squeezed his hand. "Curating is choosing what stays in the frame. We're okay with losing the rest." Evelyn left the museum as the light faded to grey. Before facing the townhouse, the plaza, and her father, she took the subway to Queens. Samuel stood on the terrace, the blue tarp folded at his feet, the wind wanting to turn pages. He saw her and sighed as if finding the right refrain. "He told me," she said bluntly, "it was the patron. You were the one who won his scholarship. And there's an invitation for Sunday. For you to play." Samuel nodded, the invitation still weighing heavily in his coat pocket, "and an invitation for you to be by his side." For a moment they both laughed, a laugh as short as it needed to be. Then the laughter disappeared. "I don't want my story with you to become a footnote to a favor," Samuel said. "I don't want them to think I approached you because it was convenient. And I don't want to be used to embarrass you." "And I don't want to make you a target," she said. "But I also don't want to make what we have a secret." Samuel shoved his hands in his pockets, searching for warmth. "Maybe we need to wait. Let the storm pass." The word wait cut more than it should have. Evelyn took a step, brought her face closer, and cupped his chin with rebellious delicacy. "I wasn't born to wait. I was born to choose." The touch turned into a hug. "If I go to the gala, it won't be because I abandoned you. It will be because I haven't found the door yet. If I don't go, it will hurt a lot of people, but it will be true. And if I play at the gala," Samuel added, "it won't be to please a count. It will be so that no one dares say my music fits into a narrative." He smiled without heroism. "Maybe I'll play between the notes." She closed her eyes, resting her forehead on his shoulder. Down below, a siren, a dog, someone arguing about gas prices. Real life. As they walked away, they decided without signing anything. They would find a way to be on the same side, even if through different doors. "Sunday," she said. "Sunday," he repeated. Evelyn descended the fire escape with cold hands and a new fire burning inside. As she reached the street, her cell phone vibrated. A message from her father, brief as a verdict. "Meeting tomorrow at 10, council present." And another from an unknown number with a link. "About to collapse. The secret romance of the Count's fiancée." She didn't click. Maybe the news would explode. Maybe I would be left on hold. It didn't matter. The clock was ticking. At the townhouse, Richard closed the last tab on his computer and stared out the window at the city he thought he understood. In his pocket were 2 invitations, the gala and a card from the conservatory. There was no anger on his face. There was determination. In Queen's, Samuel opened his notebook and rewrote the first measure of Entre as notas. The line took on a previously unheard-of syncopation. It sounded like someone learning to dance on the edge of a cliff, and in the middle of Manhattan, between Park Avenue and the East River, Evelyn stood on a walkway and breathed in the cold until she burned. Sunday had 2 stages. She could fit on only one. Sunday arrived dressed in gold. The Harrington Foundation had transformed Metropolitan Hall into a temple of mirrors and glittering chandeliers. Journalists jostled outside, cameras flashed non-stop, and guests walked the red carpet as if parading in a court of elegance. The gala promised contracts, donations, headlines, but that night it also promised destinies. Evelyn climbed the marble steps with her father and mother, feeling the weight of all their gazes. Her white silk dress had been chosen to symbolize purity and continuity, but each step felt like a prison. In the small pocket of her clutch, she hid a handwritten letter, still unsure if she would have the courage to deliver it. Richard waited at the entrance to the ballroom, impeccably dressed in a black tailcoat. He greeted her with a light kiss on the hand with no expression of affection, just a sharp formality. "You look stunning, Evelyn. The press already has your photograph. Now, the rest is silence." Silence. The word echoed like a sentence. Across the room, Samuel was adjusting the score on the grand piano. He wasn't wearing an expensive tuxedo, just a simple black suit, but there was something about him that drew more attention than the diamonds of socialites: authenticity. His eyes met hers for a second, and in that instant, Evelyn forgot the clink of glasses and the rehearsed speeches. Only one certainty prevailed: she was there for him. The program called for Samuel to perform after Richard's speech. The Earl took the podium and spoke about tradition, social responsibility, and legacy. Each word was met with precise applause, as if the audience had been trained. Evelyn, however, only heard a distant hum. When the Master of Ceremonies announced the recital, the hall was filled with anticipation. Samuel walked to the piano. For a moment his hands hovered over the keys, his eyes closed. The silence lasted longer than was acceptable, long enough for it to become a choice. Then he began. It wasn't Chopin, Liszt, or Debussy. It was the premiere of a new piece, Between the Notes. The sound was different, intimate, and rebellious. There were irregular time signatures, unexpected pauses, melodies that seemed to trace the outline of someone invisible. Evelyn realized it was their music. The audience, accustomed to technical virtuosity, fell into a reverent silence, as if witnessing something impossible to name. As he played, Samuel never took his eyes off her. Richard noticed. The whole room seemed to notice. Evelyn felt her blood boil, with fear and freedom at the same time. The music reached its climax. Samuel stretched out the last note until the air in the hall became pure vibration. Then he removed his hands and stood still. The applause exploded, dense, thunderous. But Evelyn, she knew that sound wasn't for the patrons, wasn't for the Harringtons, wasn't for society. It was for her. Richard was the first to applaud, polite and restrained, but his eyes burned coldly. He approached Evelyn during the ovation and whispered in her ear, "Now everyone has seen it, and tomorrow everyone will ask." Evelyn turned to him, finally lifting her chin. "Then I'll have answers tomorrow, but they won't be yours." The Count took a half step back in surprise. After the recital, the guests dispersed amid champagne and whispered conversations. Evelyn escaped to the hall's terrace, where the Manhattan night glittered with thousands of windows. A few minutes later, Samuel appeared. There were no words of greeting, only rapid breathing. "You risked everything playing that song," she said emotionally. "I didn't risk anything," he replied. "If I didn't play, I would lose you." Evelyn cupped his face in her hands. For a moment, she thought they could disappear from there, vanish into the labyrinth of the city and start over. But before their lips met, the terrace door opened. Richard stood there, alone, his expression unreadable. He walked slowly toward them without raising his voice. "It's done, Evelyn. The world already knows. Now it's your turn to decide whether to fight or run." Silence fell like snow. The city breathed impatiently below. Evelyn realized she couldn't delay any longer. The gala wasn't just a show, it was the stage of her choice. The breeze from the terrace brought the scent of the city, mixed with the perfume of the flowers arranged in the living room. Evelyn, Samuel, and Richard stood in a silent triangle, like pieces on a board about to move. Richard's gaze was hard but not inflamed. It was the gaze of a man accustomed to not losing, and who now realized the inevitability of defeat. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low and firm, "don't drag it out. If you're going to humiliate me, do it now." Her courage came not from anger, but from the calm Samuel exuded simply by being by her side. Evelyn took a deep breath, looked at Richard, and then at the city below, the lights that witnessed it all. "It's not about humiliation," he said. "It's about finally telling the truth." Richard frowned. "The truth, or a romantic fantasy that can't survive an electric bill?" "The truth is that I can't live a life shaped by contracts and gala dinners," Evelyn replied, feeling her heart race. "The truth is that what I feel doesn't fit in the society." "Pages." Samuel tried to speak, but she interrupted him with a gesture. It was his turn. "Richard, you are an honorable man, more honorable than many here. But I don't love you, I never will, and I won't marry you just because that's what's expected of me." The words were sharp but clean. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the impact. When he opened them, there was a shadow of sadness, perhaps wounded pride, perhaps something deeper. "So that's it?" he asked. "You choose the pianist?" Evelyn looked at Samuel, who watched her silently, not demanding an answer, just offering his presence. "I choose myself, and by choosing myself, I choose to be with him." For a moment, no one spoke. The city seemed to have stopped breathing. Then Richard stepped back, straightened his jacket, and gave a mirthless smile. "Very well, so be it. But know this. Tomorrow, all the newspapers will have their version of the story, some more cruel than others." "Let them write," Evelyn replied, lifting her chin. "For once I have nothing to hide." The terrace door opened again. Arthur Whitmore, Evelyn's father, emerged, accompanied by Helena. Both were pale but resolute. Her father held a printed copy of an online column, the headline screaming, "The Count's Bride Declares War on the Ballrooms. Secret Romance Confirmed at the Gala." "Is it true?" Arthur asked, his voice hoarse. "Tell me it's a fabrication." Evelyn felt the weight of her parents' eyes like never before, but she didn't waver. "It's true." The silence that followed was devastating. Helena clasped her hand to her mouth. Arthur clenched his fist. But instead of an outburst, something worse followed. Resignation. "Then you've destroyed us," he murmured. "The partnerships, the stocks. Everything will collapse." Evelyn took a step forward. "No, Father. I refuse to believe our family depends solely on an arranged marriage. You taught me to be strong, to work. So let's work, but not at the cost of my life." Arthur seemed to grow old before her, but something in his eyes betrayed him. Deep down, he knew his daughter was right. Richard, noticing the scene, gave a wry half-smile. Maybe she's more Harrington than Whitmore after all, too brave to obey. Helena tried to speak, but her voice faltered. Evelyn came closer, took her mother's hand and whispered, "I'll be fine. We'll be fine. I just need you to trust me." Samuel, silent until then, finally stepped forward. "With all due respect, gentlemen, I didn't come to steal anything. I just want to love your daughter as she deserves. Nothing more." Arthur stared at him for a long moment, as if examining a misplaced item. Then he sighed wearily. "Love doesn't cost a fortune, but perhaps it pays for something I can't even calculate." He turned, pulling Helena by the hand. "Let's go, this night is over." Richard was last. He stopped in front of Evelyn, bowed slightly, and murmured, I hope you don't regret it. The world is not kind to rebels. I don't want the world's kindness, she replied. I want my own truth. He gave a short, almost respectful bow and left. Alone on the terrace, Evelyn and Samuel looked at each other as if waking from a dream. The city lights reflected in her eyes. The wind carried the scent of the future. You made your choice, Samuel said, almost in disbelief. I did, she replied. Now comes the hard part, living with it. He smiled, a smile full of tenderness. Then let's live, between the notes. And there, faced with the chaos that awaited them, they sealed with a kiss not the end but the beginning of everything. The morning after the gala, New York woke up to find Evelyn in the coffee shop on the front page. Headlines spoke of rebellion, inappropriate romance, fallen alliances. The photos were chosen to wound, her gaze at Samuel on stage, their closeness on the terrace, her father in the background, frowning. Evelyn slid her finger across her phone screen like someone stroking a fresh scar. She took a breath. She stood up. In the penthouse hallway, cardboard boxes lined the floor like small trenches. There weren't many, a few art books, old notebooks, less formal dresses, 2 empty picture frames. Helena appeared in the doorway, her eyes tired but devoid of social graces. She carried a cloth bundle. It's your grandmother's, he said, handing her the object. A lace tablecloth. She used it when life couldn't fit on the table. We'd make the table bigger. Evelyn hugged her mother. That simple gesture was worth more than any speech. Arthur, behind her, kept his distance, trying not to break down completely. When he finally spoke, it was with the voice of someone confessing in the mirror. The board has met. We'll lose our partnership with the Harringtons. He looked at his daughter, and something snapped in him. But we still have trucks, smaller contracts, people who have worked with us for decades. We'll trim the fat, sell 2 assets, downsize. The company will continue. Without you at the altar. Evelyn nodded, relieved and guilty at the same time. If I can help. Help by staying whole, Arthur replied, surprising himself. Whole helps more than obediently. She smiled, her eyes moist. A few hours later, she left Whitmore's house with 2 suitcases, a tote bag and the lace tablecloth. Her destination wasn't a 5-star hotel, but a small studio in the East Village, with exposed brick, stubborn windows, and just enough space for an easel and an imaginary piano. Samuel, for his part, began to pay the immediate price. 2 hotels cancelled performances with emails too delicate to be honest. A sponsor indefinitely postponed a chamber concert. At the conservatory, no one spoke openly, but the hallways became narrow. Still, the classes continued. The little girl with the braids for the first time hit her left hand without hesitation. He gave an exaggerated standing ovation to disenchant the air. At Rosie's after hours, the press tried to gather testimonials. Rosie would respond with recipes. We serve coffee here, the rest is up to the music. A reporter persisted. She pointed to the exit with the dish towel. The diner, more than ever, became a refuge. That night, Samuel climbed to the terrace of the unassuming building, raised the canvas and played Entre as notas for the water tanks. The city responded with ambulances and hurried footsteps, involuntary percussion. Between phrases, he thought of Evelyn unpacking books, hanging the lace tablecloth like a flag over occupied territory. When they finally met in the new studio, it was quiet. Evelyn greeted him barefoot, her hair tied up messily, a mug of tea in her hand. On the floor, leaning frames awaited images. She pointed to the window. It overlooked a fire escape and beyond it a mural painted with spray-painted stars. It's not Park Avenue, he said, smiling, but it's still alive. Music fits, Samuel added, resting his chin on her shoulder, and good silence. They ate dinner on the rug, sitting on pillows with boxes of Chinese food and Grandma's tablecloth draped over them. They talked about the day, the cancellations, Whitmore's budget cuts, their father's words. They also talked about what wasn't a problem, the laughter of the little girl with the braids, the elderly neighbor who had left cookies on Evelyn's doorstep with a welcome to the mess note, the way the afternoon sun cut through the picture frames. What are you going to do now? Samuel asked. Work, she said without hesitation. Maya offered me a paid internship curating a project at the museum. Lateral voices. Artists' history didn't preserve. I can write texts, set up rooms, choose frames. She touched the wood of one of the leaning frames. And maybe create something of our own. A performance exhibition. Empty frames that fill as the music changes. Samuel looked at her with a new glow. Between the notes was written to fit within this. Then write the rest, Evelyn said. Write what's missing. The following weeks were a flurry of falling and rising. For every cruel call-out on a gossip show, there was an email from a student thanking him for having courage. For every cancelled gig, a small club in the village opened a night for Samuel to try out compositions. The first of these nights had a small audience. 4 friends, 2 lost couples, and a man who dozed off during the third piece. The second night was packed beyond the seats. Someone filmed it with a cell phone. The video flowed through groups of musicians like water finding a crack. At the museum, Evelyn learned to negotiate budgets and request lower lighting in a room that insisted on being dazzling. She wrote a curatorial text that ended with the question, who chooses the frame for their story? The director wanted to soften the tone. Maya defended the statement with a smile of someone who never loses. Meanwhile, Evelyn returned the engagement ring by messenger in a simple box. A short note, thank you for your honesty. I'll stick to mine. Late that afternoon, she received Richard's reply, also brief. Received. Good luck. No digs. Just a line that felt, somehow, like respect. Arthur showed up at the studio one day later, unannounced. He surveyed the space, sat on a crooked chair, and held his hands for a long time. We closed the sale of 2 warehouses, he said, his tone unintentionally seeking pity. It hurt, but we're alive. He looked at the frames, at the easel. When you were little, you used to draw harbours without boats. I'd ask, where are the boats? You'd answer, they'll arrive later. He stood up. Sometimes I forget that boats arrive later. They come, Evelyn said, choking back tears, when the tide turns. Before leaving, Arthur looked at Samuel with the seriousness of someone handing him a tool. Don't ask me to applaud your courage every day, but if I hurt you, there will be no music that can save you from me. And then, quietly, almost smiling, play that between the notes for me sometime, without an audience. I touch it, Samuel replied, with the gravity that certain pacts demand. The premiere of Lateral Voices was scheduled for spring. Evelyn proposed, and obtained with patient insistence, a final space for the exhibition performance, frames hung like windows, translucent fabric screens, and moving lights. Samuel would compose live, reacting to the images and the people. The risk was great, the budget small. The stubbornness enormous. The day before, when everything seemed ready, one thing was missing, the courage to call this a beginning. Evelyn stood alone in the living room, pacing among the empty frames. She placed her grandmother's lace tablecloth on a discreet table. Make the table bigger, she remembered. She picked up her cell phone, texted Samuel, if you don't come, I won't start. The reply came in perfect time. I'm coming down the stairs. He entered with his coat in his arms, his scorebook, and no guarantees. The staff turned off the lights. The conversations in the hallway dwindled into darkness. Maya appeared in the doorway, giving a thumbs up. Evelyn took a deep breath. Samuel took the piano bench. Ready? He asked. I've never been, she smiled. And that's why, yes. The first note sounded like a time warp. The empty frames began to receive projections of forgotten works, the faces of artists without inscriptions, photographs snatched from anonymity. The piano continued, syncopated, sometimes urgent, sometimes open. People entered slowly, like someone entering a church and realizing the service is different, intimate, profane, true. In the third sequence, Evelyn stepped into the space, a curator who passes through the frame itself, and read in a low voice a passage from the text that had been censored in the proof. Life doesn't need to fit into the frame they gave you. It can grow around the edge and create a wall. Someone in the background, wept, unashamedly. At the end, there was no immediate applause. There was silence, the same dense silence that precedes choices. Then hands met in a sound that wasn't formal, but human. Rosie clapped loudly, proudly. Arthur, in the last pew, wiped the corner of his eye when he thought no one was watching. And leaving before anyone noticed, a man in a dark suit left an envelope at the reception desk with a note. For the project to continue. Anonymous. The handwriting could have been anyone's. The decision, too. Evelyn looked at Samuel. There were no crowns, no easy headlines. There was work, there was love. There was a path as open as a street after the rain. She smiled, exhausted and alive. "Now," he said softly, "we can finish this story by starting another." He nodded, and as if in blessing, he played the final chord. Spring in New York brought an air of rebirth. The streets were filled with makeshift flowers in the windows, outdoor cafes were abuzz with conversation, and the harsh cold seemed a distant whisper. In the small brick studio in the East Village, Evelyn spread her grandmother's lace tablecloth over the breakfast table. It wasn't a gesture of tradition, it was one of continuity, a symbol that life could be remade, not with the weight of inheritances, but with the lightness of choices. Samuel, at the piano, was working on the final revisions of Between the Notes. The piece now had several parts, each inspired by a different moment. The first glance in the ballroom, the hidden note, the rooftop of the conservatory, the kiss on the terrace. Evelyn followed the rehearsals, not as a spectator, but as an accomplice. Each chord was also her story. At the museum, the exhibition side voice had surprised. The audience hadn't expected empty frames to say so much. Evelyn, during one of the guided tours, overheard a young student comment to another, "She didn't just show forgotten art, she showed that we can also be remembered." It was then that Evelyn realized she hadn't lost anything. On the contrary, she had gained a whole life outside the imposed display cases. Richard, on the other side of town, continued with his contracts. He didn't marry that year, and the newspapers soon found another target. Sometimes, in the silence of the night, Evelyn wondered if he missed what they never had. Not with guilt, but with the strange tenderness of someone who understands that even rivals are part of the journey. Her father, Arthur, resisted Whitmore. It was leaner, more regal, less dependent on social alliances. Evelyn visited him from time to time. He never openly admitted it, but hearing his daughter talk about frames, artists, and courage rekindled in him a pride that didn't show in the reports. One afternoon, Rosie hosted a dinner at the diner, tables pushed together, chairs borrowed, desserts prepared by neighbors. Evelyn and Samuel sat side by side, surrounded by friends, artists, conservatory students, curious neighbors. The makeshift piano occupied the corner, and Samuel played softly like a backdrop to real life. Evelyn thought that if there was a form of happiness, this was it. A larger table, diverse people, music that didn't need to be perfect to be real. In that moment, she understood that her heart hadn't deceived her in choosing the pianist, not because Samuel was the answer to all her problems, but because with him, she had learned not to run away from herself, to love without a contract, to live without imposed boundaries, to transform ruin into rebirth. Their lives weren't easy. There were bills, there were criticisms, there were days of weary silence, but there was also an invisible thread that sustained them, the commitment to live between the notes, in the pauses that give meaning to music. And you who have followed this story perhaps also know, it's not always the safe choices that save us, but the true choices. Sometimes it takes courage to let go of what the world expects of us and embrace what our heart silently asks for. Evelyn didn't marry the Count. She didn't inherit contracts or gala columns. She inherited something greater, her own voice. And that no one could take from her. Moral of the story: true love isn't a luxury, it's a decision. Life doesn't have to fit into the framework we've been given. We can always choose between obeying what's expected or living the music we carry within. And now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Evelyn's place? Would you have had the courage to defy everything for love and for yourself. If this story touched your heart, leave the like, subscribe to the channel and share with someone who needs to hear that there is always room to start over.